Okay, the next presenter is, the paper is by Tang Xiaoyang. Quiet, please. Okay. Tang Xiaoyang, and he is currently based in International Food Policy Research Institute at Washington, D.C. He was a formal PhD from the New School Philosophy Department. And the topic of his paper is comparing technological innovation of textile industries in India and China. And the two commentators are, the first is Prem Shankar, journalist, and no further introduction is necessary. Yao Yang, the director of China Center for Economic Research at Beijing University. Okay, I guess Prem goes first.
Thank you, Jianying. Now, I intend to stick to the 8 minutes. This is a very good paper. It requires updating because, as Tang Xiaoyang told me yesterday, he'd actually prepared the first draft and actually had in 2006. The revisions will not substantially change the conclusions in his paper. The revisions will not substantially change the conclusions in his paper because I also checked in one area the data for 2010 and found that the ratios were the same. Having said that, let me just give you first a summary of what he has said in his paper, and then one area which I feel that that it remains incomplete. And I will talk about that. In the paper, first of all, he talks about his purpose is to understand the different tracks taken by the development of the Chinese and Indian industries. And the most important difference, of course, is size. The Chinese textile industry in 2006 was 8 times larger than the Indian textile industry on an average. Looking at the export figures for 2010, it's still 8 times larger. So they've grown at about the same rate. And certainly the export part has. The size is only the beginning of the difference. And of course, the most important reason for that is, and particularly in the export area, is the colossal scales of Chinese the colossal scale of production in China, and the reason that he gives for this difference is interesting. He says that the Chinese industry is a very young industry. The state-owned enterprises were pretty well collapsed by the end of the 70s, and the first private company was actually set up in 1978. And then it's grown at this colossal rate. The biggest company, for example, today in China, or one of the biggest, produces 1.2 billion meters of textiles. Alvin Mills, one of the biggest in India, produces 140 million meters. Inevitably, this meant that the Chinese would be concentrating on mass production, mechanization. Advantages were cheap labor, although Indian labor was as cheap or cheaper. He says cheaper, but actually I've done some other things. They probably went from company to company, but certainly as cheap. But the productivity was higher because the Chinese labor was more disciplined, or could be driven harder, whichever reason. Because of the scale, the business strategies of the two countries, the textile two industries, are different. The Chinese have gone from mass production, basically of average lower value-added products. Having occupied those, the and I think he says partly as a result of other reasons, but not simply compulsion, the Indian textile industry has developed with higher value added, more product differentiation, and an attempt to, through smaller batch sizes of production and more specialized production, to fill niches, and there are a large number of niches in the textiles market. The reason for this, he says, is that the Chinese industry being young and having really a lack of technological expertise, they really relied upon just getting vast numbers of looms and things and setting it up, and production processes become their central area of concern. In India, it was not that way. And from this, he went on. In India, he said that the oldest company, for example, that he discusses, is 1925. Now, having done that, what happens to that? The development strategy then changes. Where do you go next? The Chinese are relying upon computerized methods of materials management to produce smaller batches, and therefore to be able to move to some extent into the markets that the Indians have. The Indian companies, on the other hand, are relying on what you might call a sort of personal and quality and customer management, if you like. And what they've done is they've gone into, from manufacturing, the big companies have gone into retailing, then from setting up their own shops, or franchising, and then finally to brand building. And Raymond's Vimal, he doesn't mention Vimal, he mentions Raymond, is a good example of this. I would say there are two brilliant analyses of one Chinese company and one Indian company, and they end with that, and I strongly recommend everyone to read those. Where is this incomplete? I found that the entire explanation of the difference between China and India was based upon supply-side considerations, cost considerations. The more important thing is you must have a market. And the demand side has not been explored in this paper at all. And I would like to make a few remarks about that before I conclude. It may be about 1 minute over your thing, but that's all. First of all, the key thing is that he has not taken into account the impact in India of, one, the multi-fiber arrangement, the differential impact between China and India. The second is the reaction to that impact by Chinese producers in relation to Indian producers. And the third is what we did because of centralized planning and various ideas, Gandhian kind of, or neo-Gandhian ideas we had, to our own textile industry to create the space. Let me take the multi-fiber arrangement first. In the multi-fiber arrangement, there were broadly two categories. There were tightly restricted countries, and they were mainly South Asian countries, with the exclusion of Bangladesh to start with. Bangladesh was brought in later on, nicely tightly restricted, towards the end of the multi-fiber agreement. There were less restricted or loosely restricted countries. There was Southeast Asia. And China, in fact, to start with at the beginning, was not even there. It was brought in later, but always remained under a slightly different regime from India. That regime got tighter and tighter as the Chinese grew, and in fact was carried on after the multi-fiber arrangement was ended, under a variety of pretexts. But the important thing is the Chinese capacity to circumvent was also phenomenal. And two things happened. One was earlier they used the Hong Kong route. For 1 minute, as I said, I'm finishing. The Hong Kong route was used for sending out products. And the proof of this is that in the first 2 years after the multi-fiber arrangement ended, exports from China jumped by 104%. Exports from Hong Kong declined by 41%. Now, that tells you exactly what is happening. Second thing is, the Chinese businessmen were phenomenally good at finding various niches countries which have not used up their quotas and that kind of thing. And then and less restricted countries. Bulgaria, for example, in one of those years, had a 300% increase in its within the EU of its export of cashmere products. And El Salvador had a 794% increase, if you please. That is not, if you look, you also find that there were substantial diversions via or circumventions via Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, wherever there was a Chinese community, expatriate community. There's a difference. Why didn't the Indian expatriate community do this? The Indian expatriate community, first of all, was probably a lot smaller. Secondly, take Malaysia, for example. They were almost entirely in the services sector. They were school teachers, they were government servants, and so on. I'm sorry, I'm not going to look at it. I'll put it down now. I'm finishing, and you don't have to keep doing it. I know what I have to do. Just don't do it again. So you're taking up the time. Hang on. I know how little I've got left to say. So just relax. The Chinese communities outside were already trading communities. The Indian communities outside were service communities. And that was a very big difference. So these were the two. The demand side situation was such. And then what we did was we completely stopped the big mills in India for 30 years. And we made reservations. Garments were in the small-scale sector. Garments, even though we know that the multi-fiber arrangements were ending in 2005, we kept garments in the small-scale sector till 2006. So which meant that there was no question of large-scale batch production possible. And that remains still our main problem. Now we are trying to get over it, and the Chinese are getting into small-scale production. We will eventually, this will even out, but it never, the ratio of 1:8 or maybe 1:6 will not change. China dominates this market and will continue to do so. Thank you very much. It's only 9 minutes, I know.
That's fine.
Okay, since Prem has summarized the paper nicely, so that saves me a lot of time. So I will go straight forward to my comments. My first comment is about the purpose of the paper. Of course, you can say, I write a comparison paper, but comparison for a purpose, right? Why do you write a comparison paper? And also, if you really want to publish this paper somewhere, you have to be aware of the audience. Are you going to send the paper to a business journal, or to an economics journal, or to an international relations journal, right? I think you're going to write the papers quite differently when you target on different audiences. So I think that's very important. You have to solve this problem. I think from the current version, you have a lot of materials, but you have to reprocess them and fit into the right audience. Then second, Prem, you actually first wrote this paper in 2006. 60 years have passed. You have to, if you really want to publish a paper, I highly recommend that you have to check the data again. For example, simply say, Chinese textile worker earns normally $100 per month. Nowadays, I think at least 3 times of that. Right? So you have to check the data again. Then there are several questions I think the paper has not addressed, but which I think are very important. First, look at your data. You said Indian textile companies actually produce higher-end products. But in the end, the labor productivity actually is quite lower in India. I'm a little bit confused here. If they really produce higher-end products, labor productivity should be higher. But from your data, it is only half of China's, so that actually does not fit, together. The second question, of course, as Prem just alluded to, is why didn't India get into mass production? Of course, you mentioned some of the reasons, especially institutional barriers over there. Are there any other reasons that prohibited Indian companies to go large? So that's another question. A third question is, any competition between India and China? Right. So we do the comparison, then a natural question is, first China overtook India, right? So China started lately, so China overtook India. Now, at least inside China, people worry about those industries going to other countries. So since Indian companies are more sophisticated than Chinese companies, is there a possibility for Indian companies to overtake Chinese companies, especially when you consider the rising wage rates in China? So the wage gap between India and China actually is enlarging, at least up toward today. So in that case, where India gain competitiveness in textile industry and take more shares out of China. So those are the questions in my mind. In the end, I think you have a lot of materials, but just in the end, you have to think about hard what kind of questions you want to ask and how to write a paper toward the right audience. Okay. Let's stop here. I save a lot of time. You didn't even raise a car.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Okay, so thanks a lot for the insightful comments. And first, just to clarify, as both professors have already mentioned, it was written in 2006, and the reason is it's the outcome of the first India-China fellowship. So that's rather as a result of the historical remembrance rather than real ongoing research. So the answer to the purpose question is I do not expect to publish it. It's because I found out after that research, I found the materials and also my knowledge in this part was still not enough. So and also then because other activities, then I actually stopped that part. But however, I still provide this paper to this event because that actually I think the paper actually gives me an idea of actually it's about a question, namely what's the technological innovation? So the key question, and this is actually very closely related to the comments we just heard. So first, it's about Prem said. It's about the supply. I mentioned more about the supply, but not on the market. That's because I want to focus on innovation, so technological innovation of these factories. But actually, I mentioned a little bit of the market, namely in China, it's why they have this large scale. It's not only because the companies are new, but it's also because in China as in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in general, the population are very poor. And at that time, the market, the whole overall buying power is very weak. So therefore, this rural area or this township factories, when they build when they produce, they kind of they can only they are only able to produce the low value products, and but also the thing is from the market, these low value products they can also sell well. While in India, the difference is it's not only because the Indian companies they have long history, but also because the Indian companies. Indian market, it's kind of for me, it's more like divided because in Indian, because of this social caste system, you have quite a rich classes, while this is rather a small elite class, and so actually a lot of this the enterprises with long history, their first need maybe will focus on this lucrative high-end market rather than the basic large-scale market. So that's the starting point. Sure, I know there are a lot of flaws in it, so therefore that's my knowledge is not capable in this, not really deep in this area. But I just say my thoughts is in innovation, when we say that, because there's a perception of innovation means to meet like something like Apple or then something like Microsoft or Indian people will say that they are more innovative, and while the Chinese they are like only labor intensive. That's the basic contrast. At least in 2006, there's such a stereotype. In Chinese companies, they only know how to do labor-intensive things, while Indian companies, they are more about knowledge. But the difference, what I want to say is, in fact, when the Chinese, they are doing this labor-intensive production, they really, when they are doing this labor-intensive production, they actually, they actually need to, this labor product, how to really improve this labor-intensive production. Actually, you need a lot of innovation method in it. So it's actually yesterday we mentioned this to make fake products. In fact, to make fake products, you also need innovation. There's a lot of innovation in it. While make authentic products is not necessarily innovative. There's a lot of monopoly and things like that. And also, but the question is this is actually about the question, what means innovation? And actually then to the high-end and labor productivity, I just want to answer Professor Yao's question. Because that's actually, for me, I didn't explain it clearly. Because that's in India, because they have this, for me, at least I thought there was such a divided market. So the Indians, they will put more like the engineers, they produce more value per engineer. But in general, like for the whole like macro level, we include all these average labors, then the labor productivity is not so high as the Chinese disciplined labor. And also then for the change, for certain, what I mentioned, it's actually in my paper, these 3 different stages. I also want to say this innovation, so it's also changing. So when the Chinese companies, they are developing, they have now this more high-end market, they will certainly then look for this more value-added sectors. While for this the Indian companies, as you see now with the gap, the wage gap bigger and bigger, and also because of this competition pressure, and also this multifactorial agreement. Actually, I have something to say about multifactorial, but I will leave it later after the session. But I just say it's actually also changing. So this technology innovation, what I wanted to say is just this China and India, they are not to break this stereotype of China is only labor intensive and India is knowledge management. But I will say it's based on history and also it's evolving. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. now we open up to questions. Mahu first, and then, yeah, oh no, okay, Mahu.
Just a little corrective. I was just a little corrective. You know, the timeline for the later part of the 20th century, when both the textile industries started off in India and China, was approximately the same. Because although we had the big textile mills in the 60s and the 50s, by the 70s, they were all sick mills. And I remember that many of the large textile mills from Kanpur actually shut down and then moved out to Maharashtra and Gujarat.
And Parel.
Exactly, Parel, right? So if that is a time when the Chinese textile industry, after the shutdown of the SEO, started up again, then we're actually looking at a similar timeline for both textile industries. So then you would have to factor that into why, you know, India sort of went a different route and China went a different route. Thanks.
In fact, I don't have statistics on this and so on. I would actually say that the Chinese textile industry has probably been much more productive much earlier even. Because from a Hong Kong perspective, and I don't know if you were alluding to this, it is by the mid-60s that the textile production had really boomed in China. And the kinds of exports that were going out that were not recorded in foreign trade data and things like that is something that could be only got indirectly in Hong Kong sources.
I just wanted to ask if you could comment a bit on the question of the distinction between labor costs and unit cost. That we know that in many of these industries, the labor cost component is quite small, in fact. So certainly wages being low is an advantage, but the totality of the factors which reduce unit costs, including ports which operate efficiently, roads which are usable, the absence of strikes, cheap electricity, and so on and so forth, are what make unit costs low. And arguably, China's decisive cost advantage has not been only labor costs, but the totality of this package.
Unit of factor of production?
Unit cost of a unit of output.
Yeah, let's have the first response.
First, thanks for Professor Mahu's correction. Thanks, I didn't realize that when I was 6 years ago. And thank you very much for this insight, for this useful information. If I will go back here to this topic again, I will have a new perspective and a new starting point. But the question, of course, is why they starting at the same time but different lines. And also then question about the Hong Kong part, that's also an interesting perspective. You can even bring this Hong Kong and the mainland, their difference also into consideration. And then about the union cost and the labor cost, actually that's the part of the paper. In fact, the wage gap between China and India, it's reversed. China's labor cost is higher than India. And only the China has cost advantage is only because its union cost is lower than India. Yeah, so because of infrastructure and this government efficiency and so on. Yeah, so that's.
Did we cover all? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think.
I think next is Ken.
I hope you will publish this report because I can call it. But anyway, I will raise a question about your definition on technological advancement. Because what I see in China is like many Indians, factories, owners now come to China to buy machines. I mean, textile manufacturing machine.
Yeah, right.
Because they couldn't get it in India on the one hand, and on the other, Chinese machine.
Oh, they can get it. It's much cheaper in China.
Much cheaper and
Half
much
the price.
faster and much more efficient. Yeah. So because your definition of technology is like, it is not necessarily technological advancement. It can be like better management or better organization of labor. But I mean, if that's the case, like if you see so many Indians come to China to buy machines, it's exactly, I mean, opposite to your argument. Then, like, so I mean, what's your comment on this kind of reverse phenomena?
Yeah. Any? Yeah, the thing is exactly that's actually not against my argument. That's a part of my argument. Just to say, I think I don't remember whether I mentioned it in my paper. I think I mentioned a little bit about the machinery part. It's also in China, actually, what they are doing is they are more specializing in this production machinery, while the Indians, they are more specializing in this customer design or this customer relations part. So therefore, they are just about, when you are, that's just my point, when you talk about innovation, maybe you say, oh, this machinery, it's only about production, but this is actually also innovative. While this customer, people will say this, at least 6 years ago, people may think only this software or this customer relations, they means innovation. But we see only this kind of innovation. If you only stick to that, it's not enough. The Indian companies, they find out they also must go to the scale production to like expand their production in order to really be successful. So for them, it's the technological innovation. As I did not give a very strict definition because I think that's actually something every companies or every countries they can really find out their way from the practice, and they will change in different times.
Okay, thank you. We are on time. I think Prem wants to add just a few seconds.
Just two clarifications, because two questions were raised about India from the table here. One, Yang asked, any reason why India couldn't go large? And the answer is, first of all, there was the fact that there is a large amount of implicit subsidy in Chinese textiles exports particularly, which now is going, mainly because of wage rises, but the thing is, it's been there, and it actually, they were already in the market, and they, for all the reasons I explained earlier, and they held on to the market, so that we didn't have an option but to remain, to grow with the overall growth. The second point was, and there's also less incentive, because there was a large domestic market in India growing, and the Indian textile industry is more domestic market dependent than the Chinese is. And the one very small point that you said, you know, Indian companies focused at the high end of the market, not from the start. Initially, we were producing grey cloth and exporting to England. There was a lot, and to other places, but mainly to England. You know, so
What I mean is just in comparison with the Chinese market.
In the later stages, yeah.
You can carry on later. Okay. Thank you, and we'll